pleasure of introducing a friend and a colleague. Gipsie Ranney has provided me personally with the foundational understanding of Dr. Deming's theories for over the past 12 years. She takes what at first appears as complex and presents it in simple, understandable terms. Every time I listen to Gipsie, I gain new insights into foundation pieces. We've drawn upon her once again to address some pitfalls we can fall into as we measure performance. How we organize and interpret data does make a difference. Please welcome Dr. Gipsie Ranney.
Thank you, and thanks, Dave. I was a little bit shocked when you said 12 years. It reminds me of something I don't like to think about too much. I was asked to do this particular presentation. The thought was that some of the ideas that I'll review here are or can be useful, and I hope that's the case. For many of you, it will be a review. You have seen these ideas and heard about them in other locales at other times. But I hope that it will be helpful. It's supposed to be an interactive session, so what I interpreted that to mean was that you should have time to participate actively. So what I'm going to do is a brief review of some concepts, and then I'm going to ask you to discuss some particular examples to look for those concepts and those possible pitfalls in interpreting data in the examples. The title of the presentation is Avoiding Common Pitfalls in Interpreting Data, and I don't recall now who it was, but someone quoted Tom Nolan in the past 2 days saying that data are observations recorded, and perhaps if that is the working definition of data, I should back up and say this really deals with avoiding common pitfalls in interpreting observations. I'm really talking about the experience that comes to us in the conduct of our lives, minute by minute, day by day, and how we interpret that experience. And of course, the foundation for what I'll have to say is my interpretation of Dr. Deming's system of profound knowledge. That to me, and I share this view with a number of colleagues, is a way to view experience and a way to interpret situations, dilemmas that we're in, and to perhaps have a better chance of reaching conclusions and interpretations that will be helpful to all of those that are touched by the actions that we take and the decisions that we make. So that's the plan then, is to review some ideas, some concepts, and then have you talk about them and share your thoughts with the rest of the group here. Now, I put in your binder material a list of these pitfalls, and these are the ones we're going to focus on. If you bring up others in the course of the conversation, of course, that will be wonderful. Contributions will be appreciated. In the binder materials, I've put in a few sentences or some descriptive material to clarify what I'm talking about with each of these pitfalls. Of course, lack of appreciation for a system you have heard about for a day and a half, and if you've been introduced to Deming's ideas before, you've heard that many times. Linear thinking, misinterpretation of variation, and some things that have to do with the way we then frame issues, frame problems, and how we interpret information. So rather than going down this list and saying this is this and that's that, what I'm going to do is to launch into some examples and try to point out these pitfalls in the context of those examples. Now the first one, and by the way, I think all three of the examples that I'm going to use, I stole from somebody that I have a great deal of respect for, Dr. Deming, of course, and then some other folks. And I've tried to be careful to attribute the example to the person, to the originator. The first one is a story that came to me from Mike Beck, who works for Toyota of North America, and he will be here tomorrow, I understand. He was a colleague of mine at General Motors some years ago, and delightful person to know. And he got this story at a time when he was doing a fairly intensive study of system thinking and what was available in the body of knowledge that we call system theory. I think he actually reconstructed this from a story that he saw on PBS about the sea otters. So I'll try to tell the story as accurately as I can. This picture describes the ecosystem that included sea otters and salmon and small fish and kelp beds in the Pacific Ocean near Vancouver Island prior to 1900. And what it really illustrates is a web of interdependencies. If you were here on Sunday night and listened to the system discussion, this is trying to illustrate that none of those individual components in the system were independent of the others. They're all locked together in relationship. The sea otters eat sea urchins, and occasionally they'll eat a salmon. The salmon eat small fish. The small fish use the kelp beds as a place to hatch and a place to hide from the salmon. The sea urchins eat kelp, and all of these components are interdependent. Now, the fishermen came along to catch salmon, and they saw sea otters taking salmon. Occasionally they do eat salmon. They observed that. And they then draw the conclusion that otters decrease the size of the catch and therefore profits. So they see a problem. They have a competitor. The fishermen have a competitor. That's the sea otters. What's the solution to the problem? Kill the sea otters. And so a systematic destruction of the sea otters in that region of the ocean took place around 1930 to 1935. They were nearly wiped out. Well, what happened as a result of that? Here's a list of results. The sea otters are no longer around to eat salmon, but more importantly, they're no longer around to eat the sea urchin. What happened? The sea urchin population skyrocketed. What happened as a result of that? They ate up the kelp beds. The kelp beds disappeared. As a result of that, the small fish had no place to hide and no place to hatch. Now we don't have anything for the salmon to eat. And what happens? The salmon leave to find a better food supply. The salmon catch goes to zero, no fish and no profit. So we might say the fishermen speared themselves in the foot. And that was due to the observation, our observation, that they couldn't see the web of relationships they were about to disturb. They intervened in that web They didn't appreciate the system, the ecosystem that they were intervening in, and they used linear thinking. If we see the sea otters eating salmon, they're then seen as the competition. The thing to do is to get at the cause that's sitting there next to the effect that we're able to observe. And so that's what we ought to do. Wipe them out. The net outcome, we wipe ourselves out. How many times do you think that story has been repeated during the 19th and 20th century because we have not understood systems and interrelationships? Well, what they did was an illustration, of course, of lack of appreciation of the system, but it was also an illustration of linear thinking. One of the things that Peter Senge has said is that we have to let go of the notion that cause and effect are close in time and space, that the cause is right there where the effect is. It's not necessarily so that the cause and effect are standing there side by side. When we see a problem develop in operations in an organization, be it service or manufacturing, it may not be that the person who happens to be standing there is responsible for and the cause of the problem. So when you see people doing problem-solving exercises that consist primarily at getting at the person who was assigned the mistake, you wonder about whether or not they're using linear thinking and whether they really understand the entire system that works together and the relationships that affect the problem or affect the outcome that they observe. Cause and effect aren't necessarily close in time or location. And causes then can't necessarily be localized to the same place. Now, another set of notions that I'd like to look at a little bit focus on variation. And those of us who've been around Deming for quite a while are very familiar with these ideas. I'll go through them very quickly. Walter Shewhart was the originator of a method to interpret the messages in variation. The messages about how the cause system was operating or has been operating in the past. And that method was the statistical control chart. The statistical control chart was intended to be able to recognize signals of common causes alone acting or special causes acting in addition to common causes. Why is that of any importance to anybody? Well, the actions that we take to bring about a change or bring about an improvement are different depending upon what kinds of causes are at work. In the case of only common causes at work, those causes are inherent to the system or the process, and the action ought to be directed at the system or the process. In the case where there's special cause in addition to common causes, the action ought to be directed toward identifying the special cause and taking the appropriate action. Now, the purpose, as Dr. Deming said over and over, for using this interpretation of variation is to minimize the net economic loss, and economic is used in a very broad sense there, from taking the wrong kind of action. The wrong kinds of actions: tampering, okay, constantly reacting to variation that is only indicative of what the system has inherent in it and produces inherently, or changing the system in reaction to results affected by special causes. Now, Dr. Deming used the experiment with the red beads as a marvelous metaphor, I think, for learning a great many of the lessons that were derived or can be derived from the system of profound knowledge. And one of the, this is a typical handout that he gave after he conducted the experiment with the red beads at his 4-day seminar. How many people have seen the red beads sometime? Everybody? Oh, great. Okay. So I don't have to talk about this except in terms of some of the lessons that may come out of that and some of the pitfalls that exist when we interpret experience, when we make observations and then interpret them. One of the things that Dr. Deming illustrated with the red beads was the supervisor interpreting all differences or all variation in the results to the willing workers. And then at the end, when he took the data of the experiment and analyzed the data, and here they are for this particular experiment, which happened in Warren, Michigan in 1992. The lesson that he gave about the information in this variation was that since the variation was within statistical control limits, the causes of the variation were dominated by factors that were common to every outcome, that is, common causes. The thing that was special about each one of these results was the individual who actually got the result, who got the red beads out of the supply. That was the special part with each one of those outcomes. And yet, the message in the variation is that the variation is dominated by common causes. So we can't ascribe that to the workers. The control limits showed then that we should have looked at the beads and the paddle and the container and the procedures and the supervision that was going on and any other factors that may have been common to all of those outcomes, all of the outcomes, as the source of this variation and also as the source for improvement. Where should we be looking for improvement? Where should we be taking actions, not on the workers, but on the system and on the factors embedded in that system? So that was one of the strong lessons from the red beads. The way the supervisor behaved, and you know that Dr. Deming was the supervisor there, he illustrated lack of appreciation for a system. He ascribed everything to the willing workers. He illustrated linear thinking. The willing worker and the results, the paddle of beads, were standing there. The willing worker happened to be holding the result, and so therefore it had to be the willing worker that was the cause. Linear thinking. Misinterpretation and variation. Confusing common cause variation with that produced by special causes. And confusing correlation with causality. That may be, in my explanation here, the same thing as linear thinking. That the correlation that he established was between the result and the willing worker. And when those numbers went up or were bad, too many red beads, it was the willing worker. He made that kind of construction out of what he observed. So the result was related to who got it as a cause. Now, this third story, again, is Dr. Deming's story, the Chanticleer the Rooster story. And that illustrates, again, some of these pitfalls that I want us to consider. You know that story if you've read the New Economics. Chanticleer the Rooster had a theory, and his theory was that when he crowed, that caused the sun to come up. Now, Dr. Deming uses that to illustrate some lessons from the theory of knowledge. In particular, no number of examples establishes a theory. A single unexplained failure of a theory requires modification or even abandonment of the theory. When Lloyd Provost was doing the experiment yesterday, he was showing many rapid cycle, small scale tests to try to disconfirm theories, to narrow down to the one that was the sturdiest, the one that held up under all those tests. And when you get something that is counter to your theory, doesn't match the prediction that you might make out of the theory, then that tells you it's time to search for a new theory. But you can stack things that agree with the theory up all the way to the moon, and you have not proved that a theory is correct under all circumstances. You have not done that. As Dr. Deming said, empirical evidence is never complete. There's always the opportunity for us to, under different circumstances, see that some pet theory that we have doesn't apply there. That doesn't mean it's wrong in all circumstances. It means it doesn't apply. We've found boundaries of application. Well, in terms of these pitfalls, Chanticleer illustrated confusing correlation with causality. Or at least he got the causal structure reversed. At least. I crow when the sun comes up. I crow when the sun comes up. When we heard the talk yesterday about creativity and what marvelous pattern, was that in the same talk? Marvelous pattern recognition mechanisms our brains are. We see patterns. We like to see them. That allows us to interpret things. Okay? Allows us to make sense out of reality. But we have to be pretty careful in that. And so a good idea is to not generalize carelessly from incomplete data, but to try to set up conditions where we can disconfirm the theories that we've established. Try to test theories. And the PDSA cycle is designed to do that sort of thing. Establish a theory, make a prediction, get data, see whether the data is consistent with the prediction that we've made. If the data are not consistent with that prediction, then we need to revise our theory. We need to rethink the situation. And deliberately set up tests so we can see what the boundaries of correctness of a theory might be. In this case, Chanticleer might have deliberately planned to test his theory. How would he do that? Not crow. And see if the sun stayed down. But of course he was too fearful of doing that, wasn't he? If I crow and that causes the sun to come up, I'm not going to be too anxious to test that theory, at least on a large scale, because I've got the whole fate of the earth in my hands. But you might think about it a little bit. Chanticleer could have set up a small-scale test, could have tried a little something to push the boundaries and see whether his theory seemed to be supported. Failing to seek out disconfirming data is dangerous practice, or can be. Trying to only accept as important data that are consistent with our prior beliefs is a dangerous thing to do. So we ought to set out to test theories, really test them. The method of difference, seeing that if I don't do A, then B will not appear, is an important part of thinking about experience and thinking about the beliefs and the theories that we operate with. Now, this last little example is from my friend Mike Whitey, and I don't know how many of you know this, but many of us told stories to Dr. Deming, and then later we came back, and the story had been suited to Dr. Deming's intention. And sometimes it didn't quite resemble the original story. Maybe I shouldn't tell things like that, but he did that for pedagogical reasons. He was trying to make a very important point, and sometimes he made the story match the point. I was particularly entertained by that because that story that he used to tell in his seminars about the women who sorted the coupons was one, of course, that I had told him, and I had even brought pictures to show him how they did the coupon sorting because he didn't go there to see it. And those of you who saw the seminar and saw him climb up on the chair and put the coupons in the box, all of that was a total fabrication. But it gave Dr. Deming a wonderful opportunity to entertain the audience, I see, and to make some points. So that was okay. I'm telling you all that because I hope if Mike ever listens to the tape from this that he won't be ready to kill me. So maybe I'll do what Dr. Deming used to do when he told people stories. He would say, if they were in the audience, he would say, "I'm sure they could tell this story much better than I." And then he'd go on and tell his version. So, so this was Mike Whitey's story, and this is the version that I heard, which may not have been the one he told. Mike said that he went to do some work with an organization that manufactured fuel injectors. That narrows the field quite a lot, but in any case. And his contacts there were telling him that they were about to have a supplier put a very costly decontamination step in their manufacturing process. And Mike asked, "Well, what caused you to do that? Why did you decide to do that?" And they said, "Well, we have this problem with leaky injectors." Well, leaky injectors is a bad problem to have, and they needed to do something about it. We decided that the problem was contamination in this component supplied by this supplier. So they obviously have to clean up their act. Well, Mike said, "Well, how did you decide that?" And they said, "Well, we tore down some of the leaky injectors, and we found contamination in this component." And so that's what I'm illustrating here with this picture. They took leaky injectors, they tore them down, and they found that the vast, vast majority of them had contamination in that particular component. Well, Mike said then, "Well, did you make any injectors during this period of time that didn't leak?" "Well, yeah, of course." "Did you tear any of them down?" "No." "Why would we do that?" And Mike said, "Well, maybe that would be a good idea. Maybe you should do that." And they managed to get some and tear them down. And I've added the results to this picture here. So over here are injectors that didn't leak. Now, what do you see there in that picture? Here's contamination. Here's contamination found in that component. Contamination not found. Here are leakers. Here are non-leakers. And what conclusion do you draw by having that more complete picture? Leakage is not a function of contamination. Okay? There's not a dependence relationship there. And so, as I recall Mike's story, they ultimately discovered that the problem was one of variation in dimension. But it certainly was not what they originally fixed on. What had they done? Generalized some incomplete data, and they had not sought out disconfirming data. They had not sought out the data about whether there was or was not contamination in fuel injectors that didn't have the problem. So they got themselves in a logical trap as a result of that. They got themselves in a situation where they jumped to the conclusion, they generalized on the basis of incomplete data without allowing themselves to disconfirm their theory by looking at some injectors that didn't have the problem. So those are just some illustrations of the pitfalls that I had listed in your binder, and there's more information there about each one of those and some useful quotes from Singy and Gilovich, who authored the book How We Know What Isn't So, and perhaps some others. Now, that's what I wanted to review with you, and what we want to do for the remainder of the time is to take those pitfalls and that list and use it to discuss the situations and examples that I've included in the binder material. Can you look at that? Now, what I want you to do is to gather up into small groups, greater in membership than one. Okay? Maybe 3 or 4. You can do as you like. And what I would like for you to do, there are 6 of those situations and examples that are included in the binder. Some of them are so patently obvious that I wonder if they even deserve discussion. But what I'd like you to do is to gather up in small groups and talk about, for about 5 to 7 minutes, these 2. Items 1 and 2. And then what we'll do is to come back, and I'd like to ask you, we don't have microphones in here, but maybe, I'm sure you have good lung capacity. And I'll try to repeat what you say, and we'll see if we can see in these examples illustrations of the pitfalls that I have talked about. So, can you do that for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll go on with some of these other examples. By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt you. There are at the end of that material, you see these 3 questions. If you could focus your discussion around those questions, what parallels do you see between the situation and the examples I've just talked about? Which of the pitfalls do you see lurking around in the example or the situation, and how might they be avoided? Okay, folks, sorry to interrupt you. Let's see if we can get some of your ideas. You talked about situation 1. Now, this is reported here as a news item. This actually came from a TV report that I saw on the news in a city in Ohio. So, not in Tennessee. Oh, we're probably up to worse things down there. What of the pitfalls did you see lurking around in here? Oh, so you're saying that there may be an opportunity there to misinterpret the messages and variations? Oh, yes. Thank you, Brett. um, so what I heard there, I don't know that I could possibly repeat it from memory, but what I heard is that there are potentially many other sources of variation in those numbers than the program here. So again, that may illustrate then what of those pitfalls? Failure to recognize the existence of a system, potential for linear thinking. Our program created this change. Okay, we had a thought from back there. Sure. The drop by 12% may be part of a stream of numbers that just go along and don't show anything but the contributions of all the common causes, all the factors that have not been identified as to their effects. So, so Dave is saying there may have been disconfirming data. Of course, it's not clear here what test scores we might be talking about. There may have been a little bit of selectivity in the reporting and what they paid attention to. There's just an enormous opportunity there for all kinds of pitfalls of interpretation. So, So you're saying that all they're looking at there is an average of some kind, and they haven't really addressed the variation that may exist student to student and what their progress from year to year might mean, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole story that stands behind this that we're not able to see. What is this? I'll ask you this question. Is this an outrageous example? Did I go find an outrageous example? Did I search for one and ignore a whole lot of other news stories in the process? Well, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. And then maybe for pedagogical reasons, I made the whole thing up. Well, what about this one? The safety directors have determined that what? What have they determined according to this story? They have determined that people cause accidents. What? Oh, it couldn't be the safety directors. Okay. Unless they're driving the UPS truck. That's what we do in Nashville. So, what kinds of pitfalls did you, if you talked about this one, what kinds of pitfalls did you list there in interpreting, in interpretation? What have the safety directors done? The safety directors have done the red bead experiment. Yeah, it's part and parcel of the same thing, is it not? There is the ascribe the outcome to the individual who happens to be there. And yes, he may have done something careless, but why? That may be an important question. Uh-huh. Oh, that's interesting. What you've done is you've picked up on the difference between this part of the story, which focuses on one response, and what might have come out of that survey. So there's even a trap in the description of, in the news story description. And we don't know what it was what the response rate was. We don't know what the other safety directors might have said had they been contacted, and so on and so forth. So there's another observation about that story. I thought here that, in particular, linear thinking, lack of appreciation for a system, confusing correlation with causality are pitfalls that may be illustrated in this description here. And there may be others. So, oh, okay. I don't know if you heard that. John said that they're going to use a common cause solution. Well, that's one way to view it, is that they're going to use a common cause solution. They're going to train all the employees because of a few that may have had accidents. Right? Is that what you said? Okay. That's one way to view that. Okay. So they have looked at the leaky injectors. They've gone and studied the defects, and on the basis of what they found around the defects, or in the defective events, if you will, they made a generalization to the whole. Good observation. Oh, the insurance companies may have written the press release. Okay. Maybe so. Britt? Yeah. Another good observation. The comment that was made over here is that this may be true. that associated with accidents are unsafe acts. But one needs to question how the system and the way it operates may drive those. I don't know if you ever saw a red bead experiment when Dr. Deming was firing people for flicking red beads back in the supply and for redipping. No, when they got something they knew they were going to be beat up for. People may be distorting the system or attempting to distort it because that's the only way they can get it done, whatever it is that they're trying to do. I took a trip around a manufacturing plant. Well, it was a stamping area in a manufacturing plant one time with a manufacturing manager, and there was this fella who had a long stick, and he was standing up on a fence around the press, poking in the around the die. And this fellow was not the supervisor of the area, the manager of that area, and he said that if I were that guy's boss, I'd fire him right now. And I said, well, if you were my boss, I might quote Johnny Paycheck. For those of you who don't know what that means, I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to come to Tennessee to find out, I guess. I would tell him he could have his job. And I proceeded to point out to the fella that it may have been the conditions under which this guy had to do the work that led him to be poking in there with that stick, even though it was against the safety rules. He was trying to get his job done. So the people cause accidents, therefore we need to train people and exhort them to be more careful. Maybe an illustration of a lot of these pitfalls in interpreting experience. And as was so astutely pointed out by someone, this may be just like the leaky injector situation, where people have gone and intensely studied the accidents, studied the defects, and drawn conclusions leapt to an abstraction from what they've seen there that are really not warranted. Look at the system. It may be the system. Dr. Deming said many times, don't just study the defects, study the process. Yeah. The observation that was made here, down here, was that over time, when we see these kinds of stories and when we may know better, this tends to build distrust in what we get through media reports. I had a slightly different view of this particular example and, or these particular examples and Numbers 3 and 4. That those, and I put them in this session partly for this reason. These examples are examples from everyday life. They don't have to do with your going to work. They have to do with your life. You read the news, you watch the TV, you get the reports. And one of the things that, to me, the system of profound knowledge and the modes of thinking that are embedded in that do for me is make me a better citizen in the sense of interpreting what it is that I get. What I get from the media. Unfortunately, I'm a rather skeptical citizen as a result of that. When I see these kinds of mistakes in thinking, or at least I see them as mistakes, over and over and over again. There's some room there, I think, for us if we have a tendency toward thinking in ways that are different from those illustrated by these examples, to spread different ways of thinking, to share those with our friends and our neighbors and our families, and to perhaps over a long period of time get some change to occur in the quality of the information that we receive that affects our participation and our behavior as citizens. Tim, you were going to say something? Okay, I don't know if all of you heard that. The question was, have I ever run across an instance where there has been a report made, or have I ever found an editor who appeared to have the viewpoint, the concept that I would advocate, and my answer to that is no. But you see, that points out an enormous opportunity. The world is full of opportunity. Letters to the editor. Going and digging up the data and plotting the data, going back through the newspapers or going to sources and getting data such as those test scores, plotting that data, taking it to the editor or sending it and saying, I don't understand how this story can be written and this data can exist. There's a disconnect here somewhere. So there is opportunity. Find yourself an editor who's a friend. Make a friend. Work on some of this. Well, I really didn't intend to come in here and exhort you to go out and try to change the media. I said to a media person that I know quite well one time that her mission, or their mission, should they choose to accept it, was to try to help their media friends understand something about variation, and there was some subtlety in that. I used the language of mission impossible, so I don't know whether they would have been able to accomplish anything had they taken the mission on. About the pay system, which is I didn't mention these two. These are the same things, just repeated. They're just further illustrations of the kinds of stories that we encounter on a daily basis. And those stories affect the way we view the world and the way that we decide to think about our situation. This last one, the pay system story, is really another story about variation, about linear thinking, about the red beads. It's the red beads story all over again. So there really is nothing particularly new in that. Now, I would like to ask you to consider the sixth one for just a couple of minutes. I don't think we really have sufficient time for you to get back into your groups and discuss those. So I just ask you to read over that example if you haven't already read it, and then we'll talk about it. So I'll give you a minute or two to read it over, and then we'll discuss. Now you've had an opportunity to read through this example. This is described as a test, and it was a small-scale test of a possible change to the company's product. And what's described in these histograms is a survey that was administered before and after or with the product change. So they were trying to get some information from their customers about whether or not they would rate the product better with the change than they did before the change. So we see, I described them there as before and after histograms, but actually this is before change and with the change. And then the comment is made there. The decision is made to incorporate the change into the product. Now, do you have any observations there about possible pitfalls or any observations that have to do with variation, interpretation of variation, interpretation of data that you'd like to share with us? Okay. So you're saying doing a one-time test where they change the product and they get these results over here, that their results might not necessarily be due to the product change, this change in results. She says it could be the Hawthorne effect. What questions might you ask in connection with what she said there? You say everybody being tested. You must have observed that there were 11 observations here. Okay, the horizontal scale is the number of respondents. If you add up these numbers corresponding to the width of these bars, you get 11 here, and over here you get 11. Okay, you see a shift in these data anyway from before to with the change. Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. The way the data were presented, when I saw the data, they were presented in exactly this way. Okay? Now, the point that was made back there is we only have 11 observations in these two sets. We have 11 responses, supposedly. Well, how much variation could we expect to see in 11 responses to some sort of a question that has 5 possible categories that you can respond to? I can tell you one thing about this. If you enumerate all the possible results of histograms, that is, all the possible histograms that you can get out of 11 responses, you might spend a long time doing it because there's some 50 million or something different possibilities for how individuals might respond. And that gets collapsed down. And it's a nasty problem, and I haven't done it. But in any case, I would question whether this was a noticeable change, something that was way on one end of what might be possible to way on another end of what might be possible, or whether this is just sort of the natural variation in that kind of response. And then the other question that was raised back here about, were these the same people? That's an important question to ask too, because the data of interest, if they're the same people, is how much change was there in each individual's response from before to with the change. These data are not presented that way, and yet I wonder, because there are exactly 11 responses over here and 11 over here. If they were responses by the same people, this is the wrong way to look at these data, or it's the less useful way, anyway. Well, so you wonder whether what you would see if you judge this to be a change in response to the product, then you're questioning whether the method of collecting the data and what the respondents were told and what information they had access to, what impact that might have had on these results. And that's an important question to ask. It's also important to ask questions about how the survey is actually constructed. I am about to go on a mission, it may be my life's mission, to try to do something about the mess in surveys. Because a lot of marketing surveys that are being done now aren't really worth the paper they're written on. The results are not worth the paper they're written on. And one little commercial for Deming. Deming did enormously important work in the area of surveys. Had a numerative study. Much of that is in danger of being forgotten. Other people also have done very important work, and somehow or other it's been lost, and now all we're seeing is the typical little customer satisfaction survey that you get in your hotel room or wherever it might be, with voluntary response, and we know not what to make of the result. So I'm off on another mission. Let me try to get some closure here. One of the points I wanted to make with this example is I suspect if the decision to make if this decision was made to incorporate the change into the product, there were many other factors besides these data that drove that decision. And it might have been a good decision. They might have made the decision because the product change meant less cost to them and they couldn't see any degradation in what the customers saw. Okay? It could have been that on the basis of a number of factors they made that judgment to make the change. I was concerned when I saw this presented in a book that it would lead people to believe that you would make a decision like this on the basis of this data with the information that they gave about how the data was collected that is so sketchy and so limited that I can make no judgment about what any of this means. Be careful. And when you do tests of change using PDSA, be careful about the pitfalls. Be careful about these things that I've tried to illustrate to you. And also, as you interpret the information that comes to you day by day in many different forms from different channels, be careful about those pitfalls. Here are the last 6 words about avoiding the pitfalls. What can we do? Study systems, understand something about systems. Use Shewhart control charts when we can. Identify, and this last set right here might be a good subject for a checklist. I didn't know I'd ever say that, but I think in interpreting information, in interpreting data, maybe it would be a good idea to say, okay, in my interpretation, have I made any leaps of abstraction? Have I taken just a few observations and done an inductive exercise that's way, way too broad. Secondly, have I identified the difference between the conditions of my test or my experiment or my circumstances of collecting data and the conditions that I really want to know about and the conditions I really want to make an improvement to? If I'm testing a new product or a new service on a pilot basis and I'm interested in what I'm going to be doing in the future, then it's very important to identify the differences in the conditions of my test and the conditions of interest to me. Use PDSA and plan to test the boundaries of my methods or my theories. Try to test the boundaries of application. Now, I'm saying that in spite of my general agreement with some of the admonitions that you've heard in the last couple of days about we're not a research organization. Our job is not to develop elaborate theories. Our job is to make improvements in our organization. Yes, indeed, I agree with that. But at the same time, when we're getting ready to put out a new product and we haven't tested the boundaries under which it will perform appropriately, and we haven't probed those, we're in danger. Danger of seeing products coming back at us from dissatisfied customers. And that's probably as true of services as it is of manufacturing. And finally, use the laws of logic. Yesterday, we heard about how we need to be intuitive, how we need to use the tools of creativity that De Bono has described, and absolutely so. But you remember when De Bono was talking about lateral thinking and saying we needed to use tools to get down these channels that our minds wouldn't normally go? When we get there, the path back is logical. We can explain the logic after the fact. So I would say use the laws of logic, because the world in which they apply and the one we're in do intersect with one another. We're not going to throw logic out the window because we're going to attempt to be creative and use our intuition. It's a balance. All of these things are a balance, not one or the other. So that's the sermon. I apologize. Dave is going to kill me. I appreciate your participation, and thanks a bunch. It's good to see you all.